The October air was warm and musky, blowing over brown fields, heavy with the fragrance of freshly combined beans, the breath of harvest. He was pulling a truckload onto the scales at the elevator near the rail siding north of town when a big Cadillac drove up. A man stepped out wearing a three-piece suit and a gold pinky ring. The man said he had just invested $100,000 in soybeans and wanted to see what it looked like. The farmer stared at the man and was quiet, reaching for the tobacco in the rear pocket of his jeans, where he wore his only ring, a threadbare circle rubbed by working cans of dip and long hours on the backside of a 100-acre run. He scooped up a handful of small white beans, the pearls of the prairie, saying, "Soybeans look like a foot of water in the field, on the field in April, when you're ready to plant and can't get in. Like 3 kids at the kitchen table eating macaroni and cheese 5 nights in a row, or like a broken part on the combine when your credit with the implement dealer is nearly tapped. Soybeans look like prayers bouncing off the ceiling when prices on the Chicago grain market start to drop, or like your old man's tears when you tell him how much the land might bring for subdivisions. Soybeans look like the first good night of sleep in weeks when you unload at the elevator and the kids get Christmas." He spat a little juice on the tire of the Cadillac, laughing despite himself and saying to the man, "Now maybe you can tell me what $100,000 looks like." I'm going to speak to you today about the topic of greed, but because you're all starting your careers in the industry, I wanted first to share this poem with you. It's called Soybeans by Thomas Allen Orr, inasmuch as it has a lot to say about the reasons that markets matter. I've been a trader for a long time, and I read everything I can about trading, from the Wall Street Journal to academic research, and most importantly, of course, the John Lothian newsletter. And yet this poem is probably the most profound piece of writing I've ever read relating to the significance of markets. Markets exist because if they didn't, it'd be hard to put food on our tables. Few would be willing to lend money. Travel and international commerce would be virtually impossible. There'd be no incentive to innovate because there'd be no way to monetize creativity. The guys in Cadillacs with pinky rings seem to get the biggest share of the wealth that markets create is another matter entirely, and it definitely gets us close to the subject of greed. But before we get there, I hope you'll think about what the farmer is feeling when he worries that his kids won't get Christmas. I don't know if it'll make you better traders or put a single extra dime in your pocket, but it'll help make you not a jerk. That said, I'd like to tell you a bit about myself and my history so you'll appreciate that my thoughts about greed are informed by almost 40 years of daily struggle against my own greedy tendencies. Presently, I'm CEO of an electronic market-making firm called Alpha Trading. Alpha is what's commonly known as a quant trading firm, meaning we use sophisticated algorithmic strategies that we send to various trading platforms on high-speed networks. We tend to make a sliver when we're right, lose a sliver of a sliver when we're wrong, and we try to make as many trades as we possibly can. A sliver here and a sliver there, and before you know it, you're driving a Tesla. I, however, am no quant. In fact, with an academic degree in liberal arts, I'm more poet than programmer, and yet I have working for me PhDs in computer science, mathematics, and engineering geniuses, the kind of people who can solve a Rubik's Cube in less than a minute, which frankly I find a bit creepy. And if you're wondering in which episode Captain Kirk kissed Officer Uhura, there's no better place to be than in my trading room. But it was not always thus. In 1982, I dropped out of law school after a year and took a spot in the Deutschmark pit on the floor of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. In a white mesh jacket decorated with the flags of the countries whose currencies were traded on the CME, screaming out my bids and offers to the boisterous cluster of traders, I was a proud participant in a system known as open outcry. It was, of course, a less technical time, one in which it was better to be brawny than brainy, a time when a booming baritone voice was a significant competitive edge. It was a time when one chewed gum incessantly during the trading hours to stimulate the production of copious amounts of spittle, the special sauce, one might say, with which traders flavored the bids and offers of open outcry. We pit traders fancied ourselves as the ultimate risk takers. We challenged multinational companies, banks, pension funds, hedgers, speculators, even the central banks. It was particularly satisfying and lucrative to outsmart them. And day after day, we arrogantly tallied the winnings. A good friend of mine who came from a family of farmers used to say that trading pits were as fertile as the soil in southern Illinois. If you threw a dollar bill down onto the trading floor, a tree with $100 bills would grow. And with that said, it's a short hop to the subject of greed. Because as much as trees bearing low-hanging $100 bill fruit is a seductive image, The reality is that most traders would be better off doing just about anything else, because somewhere on the order of 20% or less of the traders in any given pool make 80% or more of the profits that derive from that pool's liquidity. It was true in the heyday of the trading floor, and even more so now, when you're not competing against poets from Skokie like me, but geniuses from MIT who are fluent in Klingon. You know how to make $1 million in trading, goes the old stale joke? Open an account with $2 million. I could teach a course discussing the myriad reasons that traders hemorrhage their trading capital, but for purposes of today's short remarks, I submit to you that greed plays a significant role in undermining the capacity of many traders to achieve success, even and especially established traders. And greed isn't really about needing more. It's about ego, insecurity, and delusions of grandeur. It's about acting with a sense of unearned entitlement. It's about accumulating for the sole purpose of accumulation. Could there be a more pointless waste of resources? As the writer Edward Abbey put it, growth for the sake of growth is the ideology of the cancer cell. When the movie Wall Street hit theaters in December of 1987, I had a 34-inch waist. Amazon was just a river in South America, and Bill Gates was the 29th wealthiest American. The movie's actually a hoot. In it, Michael Douglas plays a crooked hedge fund manager with the wonderfully slimy and alliterative name Gordon Gekko, and Charlie Sheen plays his protege with the more pedestrian name Bud Fox. With its first-generation PCs and primitive cell phones big enough to stun an ox, it's an hysterical snapshot in time, and the screenplay is so awful it can only be described as brilliant, including gems like lunches for wimps, if you need a friend, get a dog, and Bud's climactic, insipid indictment of his mentor Gekko's insatiable greed. When is it enough? How many yachts can you water ski behind Gordon? But most memorable of all, Gekko's iconic speech about greed. Hit it, Vince. Greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works. Greed clarifies, cuts through, and captures the essence of the evolutionary spirit. Greed in all of its forms, greed for life, for money, for love, knowledge, has marked the upward surge of mankind. Now, as ridiculous as this movie may be, Gekko's speech raises some interesting questions. Is greed a virtue? Is it greed that stimulates us to achieve, to aspire to greatness, to create art, cure diseases, innovate, and invent? Oh, thank you. If greed does capture the evolutionary spirit, perhaps we're wired to be greedy as a means of self-preservation. But I remember a scene in a different movie, Monty Python's The Meaning of Life, in which the morbidly obese restaurant customer, Mr. Creosote, eats a huge amount of food and then insists he is full. The waiter, however, is able to convince the fat man to ingest one wafer-thin mint, which he waves seductively beneath the fat man's nose. Mr. Creosote, unable to control his desire for the piece of chocolate, greedily gobbles it. Suddenly, his body expands like a hot air balloon and explodes, showering the restaurant and its customers in various bodily fluids and internal organs, and leaving behind a massive rib cage and a still beating heart. So with that picture in my head, I wonder, what if I win the Powerball? Not a piddly $10 or $20 million, but one that's been building up for a couple of months and that I don't have to share with anybody. Let's say $1 billion after taxes. And since it's a fantasy, let's also say I have a 34-inch waist again. At that moment, with more money than I could spend in a lifetime, I really hope I'd cease the endless struggle to add to my wealth, that I'd spend the rest of my life enjoying my family, doing good works, buying skinny jeans. Maybe I'd take a few minutes on a nice day and just sit on a park bench and watch the people go by. At that moment, it would seem that whatever it is that today drives me to accumulate should finally and irrevocably be out of my system. But what would I do if a passerby stopped by my park bench and seductively offered me one thin mint? When I was trading in the pit, I struggled with my greedy inclinations constantly, almost as if the cliche of a greedy devil on one shoulder and a content angel on the other, whispering conflicting blandishments, was come to life. The devil is wearing a three-piece suit and a gold pinky ring. The angel is getting Christmas. In my case, he's actually getting Hanukkah, but you get my point. And for me, this is absolutely true. Greed had a physical component as well, in that when I was feeling greedy, it was hard for me to breathe. It felt like I was trying to fit my size 17 neck into a size 16 shirt. I'd like to finish up by telling you about two situations I encountered during my career that highlight what I'm describing. In the first instance, an order filler for a large money manager entered the Deutschmark pit and asked me for a bid. This broker's orders were coveted because he was known for not haggling on the price, so I bid 17, at which point he sold me 813 contracts. I just bought something like 100 million notional Deutschmark, 20 times my normal position size, and I had only $25,000 in my trading account. You don't need a PhD to understand the colossal recklessness of what I had done. But in that instant, the only thought running through my greedy little brain was how much money I was going to make as the market rallied. But the market didn't rally. What the market did for some number of horrible minutes was stay exactly steady. And with every excruciating passing second, it was becoming increasingly obvious that I was about to become another common cautionary tale. Now, as it happens, random good luck, the best friend of bad traders, worked in my favor for a glorious 90-second stretch in which the respective brokers for Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley each bid 17 on 200 contracts. Now, as I considered my options, knowing random luck is a wasting asset, I realized I should sell the bids to reduce my exposure. That was obvious. But that would leave me with a serious problem: what to do with the remaining 413 contracts. Ironically, by selling to the two bidders and loading them up with the risk that I was unwilling to bear, I'd likely end up competing against them to get out of the rest of my position. If that were the case, those 400 contracts I sold for no loss could end up being the weapons of my destruction. At that moment, the Bear Stearns broker, angry that I had traded with his rivals and intent on showing me who the alpha male was in our pit, bid 17 for 500 contracts that he did not want, never expecting that I had additional inventory. When I screamed sold, covering my long position and making me short 87 contracts, the market collapsed and I pocketed an improbable and windfall profit that I really wasn't entitled to. Another time, a few years later, an order filler came into the pit on a Friday afternoon, 5 minutes before the close. He tried to buy 5,000 contracts in the illiquid third expiration month of the Canadian dollar. Understandably, no one wanted to make him a market, and the order filler was forced to bid the spread between the front month and the expiration he needed, 20 points beyond where it theoretically should have been trading. The pit, which clears out early on Friday afternoons, was virtually empty, and I could have had the entire trade if I wanted it. I did the math quickly in my head and realized the trade was worth $1 million, theoretically anyhow. If the movement in the spread was an anomaly, simply the result of a huge order coming into an illiquid market, the trade was a slam dunk. But I asked myself, what does this guy's customer know that I don't? It took only a split second, but I considered the worst case scenario and knew that I didn't want to risk being on the wrong side of this trade. So instead, I took 1,000 contracts only, still a big exposure, but I had more money in my account then, and the worst case that played out in my head was that if I was wrong, it would hurt, but it wouldn't be fatal. The trade was, in fact, a slam dunk, and everyone who participated in it appreciated a windfall profit when they got out on Monday morning. I'd left $800,000 of low-hanging $100 bill fruit well within my grasp for the other traders to pick. Had I acted irresponsibly, irrationally even, in my cautious approach to what appeared to be a sure thing? Perhaps. There's an argument to be made. But I once saw Michael Jordan steal the ball at half court and with nobody guarding him, clang a dunk off the front of the rim. I'm not sure what an equivalent trading debacle would look like, but I'm determined never to find out. In an ironic way, you could say such caution, even occasionally in excessive amounts, is a function of my greedy tendencies. That is, the greed to survive. Probably not what Gordon Gekko was suggesting, but it works for me. There's a great short story by Tolstoy called How Much Land Does a Man Need?, in which the devil tempts Pahom, the level-headed and content protagonist of the story, with as much land as Pahom can walk around between sunrise and sunset. The single caveat is that Pahom must make it back to the starting line by sunset or the devil will take his due. As the sun rises, Pahom sets off on his great journey. He has planned a manageable route, but as he walks, the desire to acquire takes over. So he abandons the planned route, certain he can accumulate an even larger estate than he originally thought. Racing against the setting sun, he puts on a burst of speed and leaps to the finish line, but falls just inches from his destination. So great was his greed for land that he gave his life for it. And all that he needed, Tolstoy concludes, was 6 feet by 2 feet. Farmer or pinky ring wearer, poet or quant, greedy or content, in the end, 6 feet by 2 feet. That's all any of us really need. Thanks.
We read dozens of news sources, so you only have to read one. John Lothian News.